Okay. I think we should start. As I say, because some people are already online, I'm assuming, hoping that others will join us as time goes on. And first and foremost, a very warm welcome to this morning's seminar meeting. It's interesting the title we should give it and what describes it best, because our hope is that this series of learning tree sessions are interactive. I'm going to give you some insights, some thoughts, personal and based on research, and then hopefully we will have some of your own insights shared, perhaps by way of question, and we'll attempt to answer them as best we can. So welcome to the Learning Tree. This is a series of, as I say, interactive sessions, essentially for parents. When life gets back to normal, post-COVID, and we can operate these face-to-face, we like our Learning Tree sessions to be interactive with both young people and their parents. But for the moment, these are really focused very much on you, the parents, to give you some thoughts, perhaps some strategies that may help with parenting, and importantly, that will help in your relationship with the schools that your children attend. Because the one thing I've learned one of the many things I've learned in more than 40 years of teaching is that learning only really works well when it's a partnership between the home and the school, and not where one expects the other to be doing all the work. So welcome, as I say, to the Learning Tree, and this series of meetings are under the heading of nurturing the emotional well-being of students. Now that's a mouthful, and it's very pertinent to the world that we find ourselves in today. It always has been, but interestingly, probably when I started teaching more than 40 years ago, phrases like emotional well-being would not have been in the vocabulary of teachers, parents, educationists, researchers, and so on. Certainly when I studied education and pedagogy, I don't think that phrase was ever used, and yet today it's very much mainstream. The word nurturing itself, is relatively new. I mean, of course, that's what good education's always been, but it's not a word that was used too often. Nowadays, it's used very often, sometimes overused. So it's a coverall. Nurturing the emotional well-being of students is an enormous, enormous area. In the last decade, there have been numerous books written on this topic and related topics, and we could spend hours, days, weeks looking at individual elements from within it. And haven't got time to do that, and we're not going to attempt to do that. We're just going to try and look at what helps us as individuals. So it's a series we plan to have a series of 6 sessions, and you'll see there that the first 4 we have titles for. The first one, Establishing the Environment of Happiness, happened a few weeks ago and was delivered by Ms. Namita Patani, one of my colleagues, who I'll talk about in a moment. Excuse me. Today's is nominally called Negative Influences on Happiness, although in a funny way I hope its focus is more on positive influences on happiness, but we need to look at what creates the negative so that we can then focus on how to create the positive. And that will move into our next session, promoting the social and emotional intelligence and well-being of children, and resilience will be the 4th one. The 5th and 6th sessions, we purposely have not chosen titles for them yet, because we want to review, probably at the end of the next one, where this has gone, where the needs of parents seem to lie, and we will then adapt the sessions, hopefully to meet the requirements and the key questions that you, the parents, want answered. We know where we would like to go with it, but as I say, It's interactive, and if it's to be of any use to you, it's probably more helpful, rather than present a lecture on this topic, to explore with you those issues that you're finding difficult, perhaps, and to give some strategies, hopefully, to help improve the situation or nurture that emotional intelligence in your children. So they're the first four. As I say, the last two are yet to be decided upon, but we look for your input into that, please. So today's negative influence on happiness. Now, if we look at that picture of a brain, it gives you an idea. Just spend a moment looking at that and reading through the numerous flashpoints there, and perhaps just tick off how many of those have affected you at any point, let's say in the last 12 months, last month, last week. And I suspect that for many of you, the list is already quite a long one. Certainly for me, when I go through that, I think every single one of those at some point in my life, certainly at some point probably in the last decade, has been an issue. Some are recurrent and almost daily concerns, and you can see that this is going on in our brains 24/7 because it actually continues often whilst we're supposedly resting and sleeping. And if it's true that we worry about money, for instance, money worries is a huge worry for many people. Getting the car repaired, the bills that come in regularly, global warming. If you're my age, the idea of going grey, well, now I don't worry about it anymore, but probably 10 or so years ago, I did worry about it more than I should have done. Criticism from others, preparing for meetings, work, right centre there in that picture. Now, if we as adults experience these concerns, these pressures, these negative influences, momentarily, regularly, perhaps persistently, in some cases in a chronic form, we need to accept, I think, that this has been a process. These things have grown over a period of time, and they start in infancy. And there's no doubt that that is true. I mean, we can't talk to an infant about any of these issues, but the reality is from the moment of birth, children are picking up messages from the world they live in, specifically and most importantly from their parents, and as they get older, possibly their teachers, then from increasingly these days from media and so on and so forth. And they are being bombarded by information. And part of that information is positive, and some of that information can have negative connotations. If we think about how a child learns, for instance, the most complex thing any child ever does, anywhere in the world, irrespective of their intellectual or academic ability, is to learn to speak a language. It is the most complicated and complex and intricate thing that anybody ever does. And what's fascinating is that all children can do it. Doesn't matter how bright you are. They learn their language. In fact, children can learn 2 languages, 3 languages, 4 languages. Many of you will know if you live in joint families, they're sometimes being impacted on by grandparents and by others, and they're learning more than 1 language at the time. And they do it brilliantly. They do it through imitation, and they do it through learning specifically from their parents, trusting what their parents say to learn that language. So just as they learn a language, they learn many other things as well. Now, I'm not sure whether people realize this, and when I read the statistics, probably over the last 40 years, they changed slightly. but they still stagger me when people tell me that anything up to 80% of all communication is unspoken, non-verbal. I mean, we work on the principle, I think, that we, in schools, that we teach children by talking to them, by reading to them and so on. But actually, the vast majority of what they learn and what we learn and what we pick up actually come from non-verbal cues as opposed to verbal cues. I find that staggering. And if it is true, and the psychologists tell us that it is, then almost every action that we have, let alone everything that we say, is being picked up by children, is being taken into this incredibly complex thing called the brain, and it's being stored. And in some cases, some of that information comes out years and years later. So there we go. We're going to look at this during the next 20 minutes or so, and these are just one thing that's clearly missing here. If this picture was being drawn today, I'm sure somewhere in there we'd have the word COVID, because that clearly is a massive concern for people around the world, and for some, on a scale, for some it's hugely scary, for some it's less so. But it is it's a negative influence on people's happiness, because at the moment, certainly in some countries, people's freedoms to do those things that they've normally done without thinking, without worry, are being restricted. And there is an argument backed up by many doctors that actually the biggest impact of COVID, possibly in the years to come, is going to be on mental health as opposed to on physical health. And that's not to belittle the many hundreds of thousands, we're past 1 million now, people that have actually died of the virus. But what is very scary is that doctors are telling us that they believe that the long-term effects of COVID, forget the economy for the moment, which some politicians would tell us is always as important. The sociologists and doctors are telling us that actually the impact on mental health might be enormous. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide, please. We've talked about it. Now, if you were attending the last seminar, which was presented by, and I'm hoping we can see her face in a moment, by my colleague Namita Bhutani. Namita and I worked for many years together at another well-known school in Bangalore, and I'm delighted that she's joined me currently as head of primary as we start the new school. But Miss Bhutani, Namita Bhutani, is a highly experienced primary teacher, middle school teacher, and not surprisingly, I appointed her some years ago to two positions which had at their heart the pastoral care of and the emotional well-being of students, because I consider that to be close to the top of my list of priorities in the school that I was running. And in fact, it's something that has been close to the top of my priorities now for 20 odd years as a principal, as a head, as a leader of schools. And in her presentation a couple of weeks ago, this slide is taken directly from hers. She asked some of these questions. What is happiness? Is happiness the absence of sadness? Can we be happy all the time? What does it bring? What is the science behind it and what negates it? And, you know, if you ask lots of people at different age groups, let's take the fourth point there. What does happiness bring? They'll probably write you a list. And they might swap it round. They might sort of say that financial wealth brings happiness, or you know, and we've got to look at that, because this seems to be one of the drivers right from an early age. Children are being told they have to be successful. Why do they have to be successful? They have to be successful so they can go to a good school, to a good university, get a good job, earn large sums of money. And so it goes on. And of course, that's not, I'm not wanting to belittle any of that, because all of those can be important. But if they become the primary and sole aim, they can actually become the opposite. of creating happiness. They can create the exact opposite. A personal anecdote here. I have met people over the years, parents of people that I've taught, friends, colleagues, people I've played sport with, and so on. And it's been interesting to me to see that some of the wealthiest, some of the supposedly most successful people, in terms of the positions they enjoy in their companies, the positions they enjoy in society, the seniority they enjoy, the material and financial wealth that they enjoy, some of them are deeply, deeply unhappy people. Some of them are very happy, don't get me wrong, but some of them are deeply unhappy. And if you talk to some of these people, they hanker after those days where they didn't have the worries of running a large company, or worrying about where the next major deal is going to come, and so on. And so sometimes those who have a slightly more simple life with less complications and complexities within it appear to be at least as happy, and sometimes happier. So I think what society seems to be telling us very often is important in terms of attainment and achievement to realize happiness. It can be helpful, but it can be extremely unhelpful also. Can happiness be created? Yes, I think it probably can't be created, but yes, it can be nurtured, it can be developed. I think what, as parents, we're most interested in is not just the theory, but what can we actually do? And that's hopefully what we can get onto later today and in the sessions to come. And the third one there, I think, is quite important. How can we establish an environment of happiness in our homes for our children? Because if parents are doing that at home, and if we are doing that at school, then there's a strong possibility, in my view, that the children will be happy, whatever that actually means. Okay? Clearly they can't be happy all the time, so that last point there, I think, is going to become increasingly important today and in the sessions to come, that people cannot be happy all the time. That's just completely unrealistic. And those who search for constant, perpetual happiness very often, sadly, look for artificial ways of creating that, and that's a very dangerous route to go. I'm talking about things like alcohol. I'm talking about things like enhancing chemicals, drugs, and so on. So we also need to teach our children that life will throw up some challenges, some difficulties for us, and we need to work through those. And that's what I mean by resilience. And that's got to be part of what we do on a day-to-day basis at home. It's got to be part of our, excuse me, my voice is going to go. It's got to be part of our taught and non-taught curriculum in schools. And therein lies, frankly, that last statement, one of the things that I'm most passionate about. I've been involved in schools for more than 40 years. I've been ahead for more than 20. But I think it probably almost unknowingly has always been an issue for me that we need to kind of create a culture where children feel okay about themselves. Because certainly when I joined the teaching profession, and certainly as a youngster going through school myself, an awful lot of it was based upon fear, sadly. We were scared of what our teachers would say if we didn't do this. We were scared of what our parents might say if we didn't get this kind of a mark in a test. We were scared about our peers and how they perceived us, and so on. Now, if that was there 50, 60 years ago when I was at school, how much worse is that today with social media being as powerful as it is in the life of our children? The reality is that schools, I think sadly, still focus arguably too much on the academic at the expense of mental health. Now, the academic is hugely important, and nobody is more competitive in a sense than I am in terms for our students, in terms of them achieving as best they can within their potential. But if all we do in schools is present and focus on an academic curriculum, we're missing a very, very large trick here. And to me, what is so important is that if we can create the right culture, a culture where people feel good, feel comfortable, feel happy, then actually the results look after themselves. And my experience over the last 20 years seems to point towards that being a safe way to run schools. I do not focus on academic success. I let my heads of department, I let my academic teachers do that, because that's their day-to-day basis. I focus on trying to create a culture within the school where that academic success can thrive most readily and well. So for some people, they find that strange, that the principal, the head of school, talking about his or her focus being anything other than the academic. At the end of the day, I'm not in the classroom on a day-to-day basis doing the teaching, although I do still teach. I trust my teachers to impart the knowledge that is required in each of their subject areas, but I focus on trying to create a culture for them and for the students, and a dialogue with parents that allows the youngsters to thrive, both at school and outside of it. We'll move to the next slide, please, Namato. Okay, so the title of this session is Negative Influences, and you notice I'm trying to talk about positive influences, but by talking about the positive, we can, in a sense, look at perhaps what we do or what we don't do along these lines, which in effect then creates negativity amongst youngsters. That first one's quite important. If you go back to something I said earlier on about up to 80% of all communication being non-verbal, if you're unhappy, there's got to be a high likelihood that your children will pick that up, and that will impact on them. You as parents, certainly to young children, are the most important people in their lives. And if they see the most important people in their lives appearing unhappy, that is going to impact on them. It has to impact on them. So it's very important to take time out for yourselves. And I know that's easy to say and not so easy to do, amongst all the other things that you have to do. But actually feeling good about yourself, feeling comfortable with your life, is hugely important in this. Hugely important. And part of that, I think, particularly as the children grow older, is not to be afraid of expressing your feelings. If a child comes up to you and sort of says, "What's wrong, Mum? What's wrong, Dad?" I think most of us try and pass it off with our children, saying, "Oh, nothing, don't worry." Now, of course, there's a language, an age-appropriate language, that's important to use. The conversation you could have with a 16-year-old child or a 30-year-old child is going to be a very different one from the one you have with a 3-year-old child. All of my children are now in their 30s, and I have conversations with them, which I'm very glad we have, which we couldn't possibly have had when they were 16, couldn't possibly have had when they were 3 or 4. But I'd like to think that some of the conversations we had when they were 16, particularly in their teenage years, in their difficult adolescent years, some of the conversations we had there which were age appropriate, perhaps have resulted in the fact that we now have good open communication between, that's my wife and I, between all three of our children, and they're grown-up children, some of them with their own children. So don't be afraid to express your feelings, because a child will know if you're feeling down. He will be able, or she will be able to tell by your mood, by your demeanor and so on. Don't necessarily try to hide it. I think we often hide things to, we think, protect our children, but actually what we might be doing is the exact opposite. Modeling behavior. How often do we say one thing to children, but then behave in a different way? As I say, that just came to my mind. A very, very good friend of mine, he's retired for many years now. He was a colleague of mine in a school in Australia. He's a chain smoker, absolute chain smoker. Everybody knew he was a chain smoker. He'd love to give up smoking, but by the way, he just can't give it. But one of the things he was a very good teacher, by the way, but one of the things he was almost brutally attentive to in the school was catching kids smoking, which I found bizarre, really, all the time I was working with him. Now, I've talked to him many times over, and I've said to Mick, were you actually going to try to bust kids for smoking? These were 16, 17, 18-year-olds, because you didn't want them to smoke like you do now, or what? He said, no, he just said that was part of my job. The school said you can't smoke. So part of what we did, and I can remember doing it, we would walk around the grounds of the school during playtime and so on, actively looking for the kids that were smoking. And then you'd bust them, and they'd get a detention, or they'd get this, or they'd get that, or they'd get the other. It's quite interesting because, you know, as they grew into adulthood, all these young people who became, you know, they joke now about this colleague of mine. It was bizarre because he would be busting them for smoking, but of course, he was a chronic smoker himself, and they loved him as a teacher. They admired him as a teacher. He was a hugely successful academic teacher, and so, you know, they were kind of wanting to be like him on one level, and yet, you know, he was modeling in a very, very negative way as well. I don't know why that came to me as I was talking, but it was a very good example of sometimes we say, do as we say, not as we do. And as parents, we do that very, very often. You know, we have to model that behavior in the way that we deal with other people, with, what we should have been doing in schools, rather than walking around the playgrounds trying to bust kids for smoking, we should have been walking around and engaging in conversation. 16-year-olds don't often want to talk to their teachers, but actually they do. If you can find the right topic, the right issues, the right areas to talk about, you can have some amazing conversations with 16-year-olds. Anyway, there's a thought. Give them your time. There is no substitute for that. Once you've reached my old age with grown-up children, you do look back on it, you reflect and you think, I wish I'd given them more time. But of course, that's partly a reflection of, as you get older, you seem to have more time for the things that are really important in life. When you're in your 40s and you're raising a family and you're doing a job and you're trying to pay the bills and all the other things I talked about earlier on, we're super busy, and perhaps we don't give the amount of time that we should to our children. That's just a reflection. Finding that time can be difficult, but perhaps it's an important thing to do. Okay. Now, I'd like to move to the second side of this slide and move straight down towards the bottom. Set personal values, realistic expectations, draw boundaries. I've talked earlier on about verbal, non-verbal cues, but children will know what your values are by the way you live your life. And they, you know, what you say and the way you live your life have got to marry. They've got to be compatible. Children will see through it. People will see through it if it's not compatible. So it's not enough to talk about being good to others if you aren't actually good to others. So set your own personal values, and that comes back to the modeling behavior. allow your children to see you living that life, and there's a chance that they will. Now, in terms of your interaction with them, and this really does differ, and I'm not necessarily aware of the age of your children, the people who are online at the moment. We've possibly got some parents of 3-year-olds, perhaps younger. We've got some parents of teenagers and so on. So it's again about this age appropriate issue. Realistic expectations will differ and will change, but the key word is realistic. Those expectations have got to be realistic. The number of conversations I've had with parents over the years, I mean, and we're talking about hundreds of parents who are absolutely convinced that their child not only should, but must end up at Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, Yale, or somewhere like that. And from a very early age, they're kind of not only verbalizing that, they're probably non-verbalizing it as well. And the child grows up wanting to please his or her parents, and is probably very, if you just look at the percentage of people that can get to those universities, who are bright enough to go to those universities, who will achieve good enough results at school to allow them to enter those universities, but still will not make those universities simply because they're oversubscribed. There is a real danger there that children, despite the massive effort they make, despite all the work that they do, they actually feel that they failed, and they actually feel that they failed their parents. And that's a terrible thing for a 16, 17, 18-year-old to have to go through, because it looks as though all that's gone before, and at 18, a lifetime is 18 years. And a whole lifetime has gone towards trying to reach some place and not achieving it. So, I just use that as an example, university entry. Realistic expectations, because I'll repeat, hundreds of children that I have come across over the years, hundreds of children that have been in my schools have achieved the results that could allow them to enter some of those top universities. They don't get there simply because there are thousands of others getting those grades as well, and the universities have to make some sorts of choices. Often those choices are interesting to me, how they make. And draw boundaries. I think the parents that believe, or the teachers that believe that, I want to be this child's best friend, are missing a very important trick. Our children are the most important people in our lives. Although they probably won't tell you very often, children's parents are the most important people in their lives, certainly until a certain age. But there is still this differentiation between teacher, student, parent, child. And it's perfectly okay for parents to draw boundaries, make them realistic. Ideally, boundaries should only be drawn up, particularly as the child gets older, as a result of conversation and dialogue. With younger children, of course, draw boundaries, say what can be done and can't be done. But as children get a little bit older, the boundaries should be, in my view, created at least in part as a result of dialogue and conversation. And I'm talking about schools. I mean, my school rules or guidelines are very different today from those that existed, say, 20 odd years ago when I first started as a head. And they're very different from the world that I joined of education 40 plus years ago. And that's because things have moved. Some of them remain exactly the same as they were 40 years ago. Some have changed. And part of the reason they changed is because of a dialogue with parents, a dialogue with students themselves. Okay, now I've talked for a while and I'm happy to keep going, but at this stage I think it would be quite useful to see if people have any observations, questions they'd like to ask. And perhaps before we do that, Could we take the screen out, please, Nessa? And what I'm going to actually ask, if Namita can, so people can put a face to a name. Ms. Namita Patani, who I talked about earlier on, who is delivering the other seminars. She is, as I say, a colleague that I've worked with before at another school, and I was delighted that she joined me at UWA. And she will head up the primary school when it starts next year at the new site. But she will also be involved in developing well-being strategies, the non-taught curriculum in particular, and pastoral care throughout the school. And as the school grows, I suspect she may well have a different role from just the head of primary, probably more like along the lines she had at our last school, because she has a wealth of knowledge in this area, and a little bit like me, has been around a few years, she won't mind me saying, around a few years of schools. And what I particularly like about Namita, sparing her blushes, is that she's very open to learning. I think an ongoing learning. I've learned more, if I'm honest, without going into the great details at the moment, although I'd be very happy to, because it's in a sense public play. I've learned more probably in the last 2-3 years about the areas of mental health than I did in the preceding 40, because of certain things that have happened. I have taken a greater interest in certain areas. They've always been important to me. The pastoral care of students always been important. Interestingly, a little anecdote. It was actually before I was a head. I was a deputy head. I was deputy head pastoral in a quite a big school in the UK, and we were inspected by. There's a group of the ISI Independent Schools Inspectorate comes around every 3 years and inspects schools. And at the end of the inspection, our report was pretty good. It was actually excellent in all areas. And one area that they identified as outstanding and excellent, it sounds like I'm patting my, was the pastoral care in the school. Now, interestingly, I'd only been there about a year and a half, so it in no way was down to me. It was in no way as a result of my influence. It was something that had built up over almost 100 years at that school. And it was the pastoral care was absolutely central to everything that happened there, and it was recognised by the inspectorate. And so, as deputy, I went to the governors when the report was published, and I said, "Look, this is a strength. Could we invest more in it, please?" And we talk about money. I wanted to employ an additional teacher. This was before we had student welfare people and so on. And the governors thought I was completely mad. They said, "We can't afford to spend extra money on this area. We don't need to, because the inspectors have just told us how well we're doing. We've got excellent and outstanding. You can't get a better. So we don't need to, it ain't broke, we don't need to fix it." I can remember one of the governors saying, "It ain't broke, we don't need to fix it." Luckily, my head at the time agreed with, I don't know why, but he saw something in what I'd said which resonated with him, and he then picked up the baton and he said to the governors, they said, "No, I think Peter's made a good point here. We need to ensure that not only we remain outstanding and excellent, but we actually remain a market leader in this area." And I'm happy to say that school, I left there a long time ago now, after I spent 12 years there, but I left almost 20 years ago. I became head of that school as well. We did invest, financially invest in more staff and more resources, and I think it was a great move. It was almost accidental, and sometimes some of the best decisions you make, you don't really think through. You just they just seem intuitively to be the right thing. And I suppose my point I'm trying to make here is that was as a deputy, and then when I became head of that school, I continued to continue, and that's probably been my focus for 20 years as a head. that if I get the pastoral care issues right in a school, the results will look after themselves. And the evidence seems to point towards that. And that's not meant to sound self-congratulatory. It's just the way I see it. And I think if anybody was online last time, I'll finish on this one. I do remember about 10 years ago, probably now, a friend of mine, good friend of mine, who's a quite a famous personality in the UK. He was then head of Wellington School, which is a school, Wellington College rather, which is a school that's about 500-600 years old, and one of the great and good, as they call it, he wanted to introduce happiness on the curriculum, and he was absolutely pilloried in the media. Absolutely pilloried. Now, and people thought this was completely bonkers, you know. And anyway, 10 years later, happiness is now mainstream in most top independent schools in the UK, in various different shapes and forms. But I find that really quite interesting, that it needs people like Anthony who went out on a limb and said, no, this is what we need to be doing. And he needed to have the confidence to actually ignore the criticism that came his way, because he believed it was right, and he was proven to be right. Mental health of our young people has got to be as important as their physical health, as important as their academic attainment. And all three are important, don't get me wrong, okay? But it's getting that balance and finding time in a busy day that is school, in the busy day that is running a family. It's finding the time to get that balance. It's extraordinarily difficult, but it is hugely important. And I'm going to finish on that, one of those points in one of those earlier slides. Key to that, and I'm not good at this, key to that is finding time. It's finding time to take time out to reflect. I have a 31-year-old son, 32-year-old son. He's my greatest teacher at the moment. You know, he's never lived in India, but you know, he's almost a mystic, and I don't mean that if you met him, he looks the complete opposite. But he meditates every day. He takes time out, and he's realized that without his 20 minutes of meditation and his 40 minutes of reading around various topics on well-being and so on, so he allocates an hour a day to these areas, and it's helped with his well-being. And if you listen to him talking about these issues, he's much more balanced in many ways than his father is. He's learned how important that taking that time out is. And if you look at, you know, if we look at people that we've met that do take time to reflect, to meditate, to think, to read, to research, they tend to be far more balanced people than some of the highly manic individuals that we meet on a day-to-day basis. I'd like to be more like the former, but I tend to be like the latter that I've just described. I'm always busy, always something to do. And as I get older, the more I realize how important it is to take that time out. So that should start. One of the things we're looking at with the new school actually is, and it might work in India in a way it might not work anywhere else, is, you know, should we put meditation? Should we put yoga and meditation as part of the core curriculum? There's a strong argument for me that we do. I think a lot of our parents will think we're completely bonkers if we do, because they'll want more chemistry, more physics, more maths. You know, who needs meditation? Who needs yoga? Actually, there's a body of evidence out there that proves, doesn't suggest, it proves that exam performance is enhanced by yoga. So that's a good enough argument for having it as part of the core curriculum worldwide, I would have thought. Anyway, I digress. I could go on for hours about what should be on the core curriculum across the world. I'm going to stop for a moment and see if anybody has anything, or Namita, if Namita has any observations she'd like to make, or if there are any questions that any individuals would like to ask.
We do have a few questions. Uh, so, yeah, please ask your question directly.
Mr. Peter, there is Ms. Tahseen Ismail who has asked a question. She asked if she wants you to share some inputs about how to deal with children and getting them to adapt and also connect with their peers in the present COVID situation. It's written
Sorry.
in the chat box.
All right. Okay. Hang on. Now you're really challenging. So it's a parent that wants to know how children connect with their peers.
Yes, during the present COVID situation. So,
Well, I mean, I think my immediate response to that is awful as COVID is, and it is awful, and it has thrown our lives upside down. The very fact that we're doing what we're doing at the moment is amazing. The technology is there. Sadly, the technology is often used badly and incorrectly. You know, if you look at the way in which the technology and some of the social media platforms are used for trolling and bullying, and that's very, very sad. But they're also there and available to do amazing things like we're doing at the moment. I have connecting is probably the most important element of in happiness. I have 3 children. One lives in New York, one lives in Sydney, Australia, and one lives in the UK. And normally I'm in India. I'm not at the moment because of COVID. So our family is in literally 4 different corners of the world. Now, when I was a child, my parents couldn't afford for us to be on the phone for more than literally a minute at Christmas when we were ringing our grandparents in Australia. It was just prohibitively expensive. And I remember well, and I was one of 5 children. I remember well, you know, we were given a few seconds to say hello to grandma, and then we had to pass the phone to one of our siblings. And so it was good, but it was awful in another sense. Today, at no expense, I can have a Zoom call with as long as I can find the right time slot, with all of my children and my grandchildren and all around the world. It is amazing. So it is good that we've got the technology, but it doesn't make up for personal contact. However good the technology is, it goes back to this non-verbal communication. When we're with people, we can pick up much more. But I haven't really got an answer for that parent other than to say, use the technology, use it well, because it's there. But, you know, and I think increasingly, well, it depends what the situation is in the area in which you live. England at the moment and France at the moment have got so many different rules and regulations going around because of COVID. Some places you're allowed to meet people, some places you aren't. Sometimes some places no more than 6 people. Some places no more than 2 households able to meet, and so on. I mean, I think to me, the big one is social distancing. I think you can still have a conversation face to face with people. I still go for a walk every day. And at my age, I'm a bit careful, really quite careful. I don't want to catch this thing, but I still do interact with people when I'm out walking and converse with them and talk about a whole range of things, mostly COVID at the moment, but from in a socially distanced way. Now, what is interesting for that parent is that whereas India seems to have opened up everything, and lots of countries are doing this because, you know, they want to get the economy running, they haven't opened schools. England is the opposite. England is probably being quite draconian in terms of some of restaurants, cafes, cinemas, etc., etc. They're closed or they're curfewed, but the schools are back. And I find it interesting, you know, I don't want to get into politics here, but I suspect it's, you know, if there's a right way to deal with COVID, one would hope that the whole world was doing the same thing. In any one country, different states see it different. I mean, I've got family in Australia. Australia, every state is doing it differently. So I'm very conscious that's not a great answer for the parent that's just asked, but we are far more fortunate today than we were 20, 30 years ago in terms of the availability of the media. Use it, because there's not much else they can do. If they can, and as they're allowed to meet socially, then impress on them, please, the importance of social distancing, because the universities went back in England, whereas, you know, I could understand people wanted to get people back to school for the mental health reasons. They opened the universities in a way that I thought was completely unnecessary. And of course, there's been a massive, massive second spike amongst the universities in the UK. 1st of September was the first day back to university. They all got together, rightly or wrongly. When they all get together, they tend to party, drink, and so on and so forth. And some of these universities have just gone scarily berserk with COVID numbers. So if and when, yeah, it's about having this conversation with your children, isn't it? That's impressing on them the importance. It's setting boundaries, setting realistic boundaries. It's good, I think, for children to interact with one another if they can, but do it in a socially distanced way, right? I don't know if that's answered the question. Any other questions? I mean, those of you who've been to, have met me before or have listened to me talking at open days and so on, I'm very conscious of what I'm about to say is very repetitive. But the absolute key to all this is communication, right? And communication is a two-way thing. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking to a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 16-year-old. As I said before, the conversations will be different, but communication is two ways. That means you have to listen as well as give an opinion. As adults, as teachers, as politicians, as leaders in society, as the police force, as whoever it might be, people tend to give instructions and then just move on. That's not a dialogue, that's not communication. And that's one of the reasons why we see some of the unrest that we've seen around the world. We need to listen as well as give our opinion. And that's quite difficult for us as parents, if I'm honest. And listen to what they have to say and have them believe that what they have to say is important to you. Because if you belittle what they say now and say, oh, that's not important, or that doesn't matter, or whatever phrase you use, or even give them the message that what they're trying to share with you is really unimportant, they won't come back to you. They won't ask the next question, which is perhaps more important. Now, if I want, you know, if you want some stark evidence of this, and probably one of the reasons I do what I do, for many years I was a child protection officer in schools, and then ultimately that's still my responsibility as a head. And if I go back to my own school days, there were some teachers in that school that, you know, we as teenagers thought they were a bit dodgy, they were a bit strange, a bit weird. What we subsequently found out following the Royal Commission into historical cases of sexual abuse against children, which is still ongoing in the UK, is that some of those individual teachers at my own school were actually serious paedophiles, serial paedophiles. And some of them are now in prison. Some of them we kind of suspected were a bit weird, but what was really difficult for us as adults, and we talk about it a lot when we get together as friends, you know, alumni, is some of the people that have been convicted, we would never have suspected. And what we've learned is that they operate under a cloak of fear for the child. And so if you have a child, and I'm taking one of the most extreme examples, and I don't want to scare people in that, but I don't apologize for either. If a child is feeling uncomfortable about something and they come to you and they want to talk to you, they are very unlikely to tell you straight out what the issue is. They will hint at, they will talk around it, and if what they receive from you being parent or you being teacher, is you're too busy, or you can't really understand that, or you don't want to believe it, or whatever, then you've just shut down that communication. And what has come out from this commission, I was an expert witness at it as well. It was very, very harrowing to see some of the stuff that came out. What was clear was that one of the reasons this went unchecked for decades, very often around the world, was because people didn't speak out about it, didn't talk about it. And when they tried to raise the issue, people didn't listen. And the people we're talking about were the people who should have listened most. They were the parents, they were the teachers, they were the people who, in a sense, they admired and looked up to most. So, excuse me, the need for them to believe that what they have to say is important, and for you to, is absolutely paramount, okay? They will come to you if they feel you won't judge them. And sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes that's very difficult. And it's a skill that you have to work at. I don't think anybody has it naturally. I mean, I appointed Namita to the job that she had because I thought it was a natural talent she had. I've come to learn subsequently that it's something she's worked at and learned. I think there's an innate strength there. But it is something we need to work at. Every parent wants to do the best for their child. I mean, we talk about unconditional love. And on one level, parents do have unconditional love for their children, but you've got to show that it's unconditional. Because although we know it's unconditional, sometimes the message we give to our children is something different. As teachers, very often, if we're good teachers, we have a love of our children, we have a desire for them to be the best they possibly can be, but sometimes the verbal and non-verbal messages we give out to them are the opposite. And they, rather than open up with us, they close up, okay? Worries and troubles need to be shared, and so on. So, in summary, happy children will not only be happy and have a chance of growing into balanced human beings who will have good relations with others. They will learn better. And our role as educators in schools is to ensure that the learning is as best as it can be. But central to that, in my view, is ensuring that there's positivity running through the school in everything that we do. And there's an absence of fear, because that's the kind of context and culture within which learning can really take place. And ultimately, I believe the youngsters will get the results that they're capable of in that context. And even more importantly, we'll move on to having successful lives. Finally, perhaps for me, is children have got to do part of this themselves. You can't do everything for them. They need to learn to deal with their own emotions. You as parents, we as teachers cannot fix everything. Just being there to listen. A lot of people know the answer. If I'm an alcoholic, I know I shouldn't drink. Alcoholics Anonymous works, I believe, because people go there and they talk about their experience and others listen, not just other addicts, but also the people who are working with the addicts. So just the exercise of listening, having people listen to you, can sometimes be part of the route to recovery and therapy, within therapy, right? If all an alcoholic is told is that it's wrong, that doesn't help them. They know it's wrong. Okay, and we can draw analogies with that in so many. I don't know why I chose that one, but it's it's a good example. I have friends who are alcoholics who are they're recovering alcoholics, and they talk about this. You know, the need for they know what the issue is, but they need to have people to listen to them, listen to the experience, and that in itself is part of the healing process. So we as parents and teachers need to be, as I say, prepared to listen, but also recognize we can't fix everything. Ultimately, a lot of things have to be fixed by the individual themselves. Children who never learn to deal with negative emotions are in danger of being crushed by them as they become adolescents and adults. Okay. I think that's enough for me. Any comments from anybody that, and if you don't want to make the comments now, please put them on email or to our marketing department. If it's been helpful, I hope it has. If there's anything we could have done better, please let us know. But let's open it up. Is there anything anybody would like to say, comment, ask? I'm conscious I've probably talked too long. Everybody's quiet. Now, is there any observations, any thoughts, any questions?
Hi, sir.
Yeah.
A very good afternoon to you.
Hello, hello.
Hi, I'm Tahseen from Bangalore.
Hi.
Hi, sir. A very interactive session. I like the key points that you addressed, and every point was really worth pondering over. I was observing the step-by-step points that you were talking. Being a pre-primary teacher, I totally agree with you, sir. Every aspect of what you spoke is so relevant, especially for today's time.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. And as a pre-primary teacher, you're more important than most people. Second, probably only to parents. Because yes, if you get it wrong, it's pretty difficult to undo. It's so important that at each stage, everybody gets this right. By the way, that sounds very aggressive. As parents, as teachers, we can only do our best.
True.
You know, and as parents, no, we don't go to university to study how to be a parent. As teachers, I believe we have a greater responsibility to get it right because we have been trained.
True.
And I think the training that certainly I went through and Namitar went through, because we've been doing this for a while, was different now from the training that we should be going through today. And I'm very encouraged to see in pre-primary and primary around the world.
Yes, sir.
People recognize the need of experiential learning and so on. Look, the reality is India is the most successful country in the world ever in the history of mankind in terms of what it's achieved through education. I mean, it's pure numbers, you know, 1.4 billion True. People. And, you know, what it's done over the last 20, 30 years has been extraordinary. But it has done it on the back of didactic learning, you know, which is sit down, shut up and listen, right? And that has started way back in primary schools. Good primary schools never really did that because little kids don't sit down and shut up and listen. They have to be, so pre-primary and primary teachers have always been good at this because you can't do anything else. Sadly, as we've moved through middle school and secondary and into universities, because that's where it all started. Actually, universities were all based on lectures where people sat in a lecture hall without any media and they sat and they listened. It was all auditory learning, right?
True.
So that is the bit that has to change. And that's one of the reasons why at UWA, we've chosen the curricula we have, and ultimately we move towards the IB diploma, which is a more experiential skill-based learning. But that has to start with you in pre-primary.
Yes, sir.
Delighted to hear. I'm sure you sound to me as though you're an excellent practitioner.
Thank you, sir.
When we're looking for more teachers, make sure you keep in contact with us.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I would like to have a session where I could meet you personally also, because
Sure.
I could learn so much from you and from your experiences, to take my journey forward. I would love to meet you when all this settles down, definitely.
Yeah. When I'm back in the country, I mean, I'm in France at the
Yes.
moment. You know,
Okay.
I can't even get on a flight to India. It's
Yes.
quite running a school from the other side of the world, but I'm lucky because I've got, well, none of us are physically in the buildings at the moment. Yeah,
Yes.
look,
Thank you, sir.
I think the reason we do Learning Tree, and the first ones we did were face to face. They were, you know, in a room together, and that's why we will continue to do these. We believe the Learning Tree is a very important part of what we do. It's not just for our parents; it's for anybody that's interested, because it's about sharing. It's about dialogue. It's about communication.
True.
It's about sharing anecdotes. I've learned more from personal experience and anecdotes than. But as I say, I'm learning more from my 30-year-old son at the moment than I can teach you, because we learn from others. Thank you
Yes,
for that.
sir.
Anybody else?
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Well, it's a Saturday. Thank you for making time on a Saturday. For me, it was quite easy. It's now 7:30 in the morning. It's a nice early start to the day. I'm very conscious that for you, it's almost bang in the middle of your day. So I do appreciate you taking time to come online and listen. I repeat that I hope it's helpful. I don't have all the answers. I hope I've got a number of thoughts and suggestions that might be helpful. But I think the key thing in all this is don't beat yourself up from all that I've said earlier. Don't suddenly say, oh my God, I'm doing this wrong, I'm doing that wrong. We do our best. We do our best. And I think the more we reflect on it, and to me, it's that taking a bit of time out, which I've never been good at. Taking time out to listen to others, to read around the subject, to think about what we're doing has got to be a good thing. That's my parting thought. I do hope it's been helpful. I hope you join us. Namita, you've got a slide for the next, I think it's 7th of November, but I might be wrong. Namita's just going to put up another slide. Our next session will be led by Namita, and you can see there, session 3, promoting social and emotional intelligence in children. I mean, in a sense, all of these sessions are on the same thing, and we're going in and out and around about, and we're revisiting things that have been said in the first one, and because essentially they all interlink. But the next one, which we hope you will join, and if it's been helpful and you think there are others that might benefit from it, let them know, and we can send them an invitation. But that will be on, there we go, I was right, November the 7th, on a Saturday, same time, same places, and we hope to see you then. And that'll be number 3. We'll then have and finally, if you're interested in discussing anything more with us, please do. I've given, what I've been talking about underpins my philosophy, it underpins Miss Namita's philosophy, and it underpins what I'm trying to do and will continually try to do with all my teachers, to impress upon them the importance of going about our business in a certain way and creating a culture where essentially youngsters feel safe, secure, loved, and secure in the knowledge that we're there for them and we're there to do the best by them. And that's what all good schools try to do, in my view. Some do it better than others, but there we go. So if you want to contact us, please feel free to do so. There's some information there. If you want to log into the next session in November, please do. If you have any thoughts, questions, criticisms, they're fine too. Please send them on to us. you know, the lady who just came on said it's been very interactive. For me, it hasn't been interactive enough, but it's difficult to do. But I hope it's been helpful. Okay, any final comments from anybody? Otherwise, we might close down. Thanks very much then. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Armstrong. That was very helpful. And I think it was helpful because you speak from experience, having worked in, different schools in different countries, Greece, India, UK, Australia. So even the geographical locations might have been different, but, the underpinning, the human psychology remains the same. And how you nurture children, that remains the same despite different lifestyles or culturally different backgrounds. So, and talking about human psychology, it's such a dynamic field, it's changing all the time. You mentioned in the beginning that when you started, it wasn't like this, or when I started my career, there wasn't so much of a focus on, how to nurture children, or, even look at their emotional growth or their mental well-being. It was just get on with your work. So as we progress forward in science and psychology, more, things are revealed to us. And as educationists, I think, and parents also, it's our, it's a moral duty to, keep up with such things and open doors for children. They have to walk through it themselves, as they have to do something themselves. Mr. Armstrong was very clear about that. But yes, definitely help them. And one thing that, struck me was that we have to create an environment for them to succeed. And that environment can be created by parents and the school, at home and at school. That's what we can do. The rest, they'll do themselves. So the environment is right. They will make the right choices. They will pick up the right cues. They will, succeed academically. And also, it's all about the child. Once you figure that out, everything else falls into place, I think. So.
Absolutely spot on. Thank you for that, Namita. I did one thing, we don't rehearse this. What Namita just said is absolutely right, but here's an interesting one. My experience over decades now is that sometimes, despite the youngsters being at what I consider to be a good, nurturing, loving school, despite having wonderful parents who, on balance, most of the time do most things really, because none of us do everything perfectly all the time, things still go wrong. Things can still go wrong because sometimes youngsters are influenced more, if only momentarily, by outside influences, and that can be social media, that can be drugs, that can be a whole range of things. And I said earlier on, don't beat yourself up. Despite our best efforts, sometimes things go wrong. They don't, from my experience, tend to go wrong permanently if the initial building blocks are there, right? If we get it right from pre-primary, if we get it right as parents, if we get it right as teachers, yes, kids will do things that they shouldn't do. Kids will make mistakes. There will be casualties along the way, but most, because they will make mistakes as part of the growing process, they come back to a sense of the values and so on that we're trying to inculcate and nurture at home and schools. So, don't feel you're a failure if your 16, 17-year-old seems to be throwing everything back in your face despite your best efforts over the last 15, 16 years. They will come back to you, right? And I talk from the experience of watching thousands, tens of thousands of youngsters over the years. Some of them were absolute nightmares at 16, 17, and they've turned out to be wonderful, wonderful 30, 40, some of them now 50-year-olds. It's extraordinary to watch. And you look at them and you think, oh, I remember you at 16 when you did that. If you trust them and you believe in them, yeah, of course some will get it wrong and they won't. But the vast majority, from my experience, have a few moments, but they end up being great people, wonderful people. But they won't unless the building blocks are there in the early stages. So as Namita said, we have that responsibility to keep in tune with what works, right? And not just, I could go on for hours on this one. Anyway, thank you for that, Namita. That was good. And it was good that you've had a chance to listen to her a little bit and get a feel for her if you weren't on the first session, because we are very much a joint act in this area. And some of the other key staff that I've appointed over the years, some of the staff that we've got in Coromandel at the moment do buy into what we're talking about, and increasingly as I employ more and more staff, that's central to me, not just how good a degree they've got, but actually how they go about their teaching and how they go about nurturing youngsters in the context of their academic subject in secondary schools, or just how they nurture children on the learning journey in the primary. So it's not rocket science, but we've got to work hard at it. Anybody else? You must all be getting close to lunchtime over there. I won't keep you any much longer. I'm missing my Indian cuisine because you can't get it in England. All the Indian restaurants I've learned seem to be cooking Bangladeshi food. It's very different from, it's nice, it's lovely, but it's subtly different from what I was eating in South India. So I'm looking forward to getting back. Okay. Namita, thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us. Please do join us on the 7th of November for the next session, which will be delivered by Ms. Patani. Take care and have a great afternoon and a good weekend.
Thank you.
Peter left.